Hey y'all, it's Sarah, the social worker. Thanks for joining me today. Today's discussion is all things trauma. I do want to caution you, if you are a victim of trauma or you are currently working through trauma, that this may bring up some of those feelings for you, and if it does, I would urge you to reach out to your support system or your therapist to seek professional counseling. Today's guest is Diana Anzaldua. She is a licensed clinical social worker, and she is informed on trauma care for BIPOC communities, which is communities of Black, Indigenous, people of color. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe at the end of this video, and I hope you enjoy this discussion. Before we get started today, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our special guest, Diana Anzaldua. Diana Anzaldua is a BIPOC licensed clinical practitioner and trauma-informed yoga teacher in Austin, Texas. As founder and owner of the Austin Trauma Therapy Center, she teaches clients new skills for coping and adapting to daily stressors of life as a survivor of trauma so they can live the life they imagined by connecting with their authentic selves. Diana has been featured in Bustle, Hello Giggles, Yahoo, and the Atlantic Journal. You can learn more about Diana and see free wellness tips on her website, which I will make sure to link in the description below. Thanks for tuning in today, and I can't wait to share everything that Diana shared with me. Hey y'all, it's Sarah, the social worker, and today I have an awesome guest, Diana Anzaldua, and I am so excited for her to talk to us about trauma and her work in trauma resiliency. And she also has a background in some yoga, so I'm hoping that she'll tell us a little bit about that today too. So Diana, will you please introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be here. So I have been doing this work, trauma work, for about 10 years now. I own Austin Trauma Therapy Center, and I'm also a trauma-informed yoga teacher. I help clients, learn new skills for coping and adapting to the daily stresses of life. That way we can connect to our true authentic self post-trauma. So I'm really excited to be here and talk a little more about trauma.
Yeah, so what is trauma? Because when you think of trauma, you think of like getting in a car accident or being abused as a child. But some things are not that extreme, but can still be traumatic, right?
Right. So trauma is basically anything that overwhelms our nervous system, any feeling that we have that we could die, and it activates our fight, flight, or freeze system. So when this happens, we get all this rush of the stress hormones, the cortisol, that's preparing our body to fight or flight or freeze. And when it happens continuously, our body may not be able to flush these hormones out. Right. And I like that you mentioned, is it a car accident? Because yes, it could be. So trauma, there's 3 different kinds of trauma, right? There's acute trauma, which is a single incident trauma, maybe a car accident, falling off a bike, something like that, right? That's a single incident trauma. And then there's chronic trauma. And this is a repeated, maybe emotional abuse or some kind of situation where you are repeatedly being in a situation where this trauma keeps reoccurring, right? And then there's complex trauma. And so complex trauma is multi-layered. It could be a combination of single incident and multiple, but these are all unresolved traumas that get stacked on top of trauma, So that's essentially what trauma is.
Okay, so we can experience trauma basically at any age. And I'm taking that trauma doesn't discriminate. So nobody's really immune to trauma, would you say?
Right. Okay. Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, I want to go into that just a little bit deeper because, this could look like isolation. Trauma could be something that's shaming, right? Or any kind of racism, invalidation, emotional neglect, bullying, mistrust.
Yeah.
So lots of those situations that we experience in our day-to-day life can be traumatic.
How could somebody know or recognize that they have some of the symptoms of trauma? Or or what can they do to kind of protect themselves when they are feeling overwhelmed?
Yeah, so the way that people would recognize that they are having trauma is because they're maybe having some kind of response, like a physical response that might be, you know, like a panic attack
Mm-hmm.
or anger, something like that, that they're reacting to. That might be an idea of what, you know, there's some kind of trigger that's happening. There's some kind of trauma that's
Right.
present.
Yeah, definitely. And so going back, kind of talking about racism being a form of trauma,
Hmm.
um, can we talk a little bit about you? I think I saw it on your social media talking a little bit about communities called BIPOC. So can
Hmm.
you kind of explain to us what that community is and how trauma is relevant in those communities?
Yes, yes. Um, so right now it's Minority Mental Health Month,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And what we're learning is that um, there's a lot of this word minority is not really. We're trying to move away from that, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
because what we're learning is the minorities are now getting closer to be the majority, right? And
Definitely.
so we're replacing this word minority with BIPOC, which is
Okay.
Black, Indigenous, People of Color.
Okay.
And so that's where some of this is derived from. But within these BIPOC communities, we're learning that there has been, you know, years and hundreds of years of racism, institutional racism, just all types of disadvantaged
Mm-hmm.
communities within this, you know, these BIPOC communities.
Yeah.
So
I think it's so awesome that it's like you said, the minorities are moving towards the majorities, but
mhm,
sometimes when people think of a minority in racism, they just think Black people. But there are
right,
so many other communities and populations that fall under this BIPOC community, but aren't
right,
receiving the same, have gone through traumatic experiences, but are not receiving the same types of publicity. So I think it's really
right.
important that people understand that there
Yeah,
are others going through serious events like this.
yeah, absolutely.
So, to touch on a little bit more about what Minority Mental Health Month is, um, what can we do as viewers or practitioners? What can we do to spread awareness of Minority Mental Health
Hmm.
Month? To be honest, I had no idea until I started seeing people posting about minority mental health. So
Hmm.
it's obviously something that's not talked about commonly in like pop culture or whatever. So what can
Right.
we do to help with this?
Yeah, so Minority Mental Health Month actually started in 2008.
Okay.
And it was a way to just kind of bring awareness to the, you know, the mental health struggles that minorities face.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in so many of our communities of color, there's still a lot of stigma
Yeah.
around mental health, and we still don't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
We want to, you know, just kind of avoid it. You know, we keep busy, we stay busy, we do, you know, focus on all these other things, or we use religion
Yeah.
as a way to kind of help cope. So this is really great. It's great that we have this month to just really highlight and bring awareness to the mental health that communities of color face.
Definitely. So talking a little bit about culture and in your profession, have you seen um, a variety of ways that different cultures are handling their trauma?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it goes back to stigma.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what I've seen in some communities of colors is there is a heavy reliance on faith.
Mm-hmm.
So we've seen that, but also I want to bring in a little bit of some maladaptive ways that people are coping,
Yeah.
in that substance use, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
substance use is a form of self-dissociation,
Mm-hmm.
which is like, we don't want to feel, we don't want to, you know, that's a way of kind of getting out of our reality, and using substances as a way to do that, to deal with maybe some past traumas.
Right. Yeah, and that's, I mean, we see it. so much now in the media talking about self-medicating, opiate
Mhm.
abuse, things like that. And what some people might not be aware of is that's kind of been around for a long time, whether it was with opiates or something else. But
Right.
yeah, oh my goodness, so much to touch
Yeah.
on. So again, kind of circling back to what we see in the media,
Hmm.
is it, I've heard this term vicarious trauma thrown around a lot.
Right.
And if you can kind of explain what vicarious trauma is, and then to follow on with vicarious trauma, what me or somebody else as a viewer, can they be victim to vicarious trauma, I guess
Hmm.
you would say?
Yeah, yeah, most definitely. So, so vicarious trauma is basically it's overwhelm. It's emotional overwhelm from having to hear countless stories of people's trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it happens over time. It's not like a one-time thing. I mean, unless you're reacting to it in your own trauma body,
Right.
right? Um, but it's repeated exposure to
Mm-hmm.
hearing these stories over and over and over, and that can be really overwhelming for the body. If you are constantly watching like violent movies that
Mm-hmm.
you have unaddressed trauma to, then that could definitely bring up some things for you. You know, you mentioned social media, and yes, people who continue to maybe to read stories of vulnerability, you
Mm-hmm.
know, people's trauma, that could also bring up some vicarious trauma.
Yeah, definitely. That's so how can we protect ourselves, I guess, from being
Hmm.
overexposed to this trauma, but still remain empathetic to
Right.
different situations, knowing that we are not completely shutting ourselves off, but still trying to fix some social injustices.
Yeah, yeah. So I like that you said protect ourselves, because I think ultimately that that's really the basis, right? Is we have to figure out how to protect ourselves. And I'm not sure if you're aware of window of tolerance, but in trauma we teach window of tolerance, and so
Mm-hmm.
basically this is our window. We all have our own individual windows that
Yeah.
we can tolerate certain things. And for some people who have not done some of this trauma work, their windows may be really small, like, you know, really tiny.
Yeah.
And for other people who have done work, their windows might be really huge, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important to recognize what your window of tolerance is, because when you start to go outside of that window, you may notice anxiety, or, you know, on the other end of the spectrum, you may start to notice some depression,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So it's important for people to recognize, you know, checking in with the body to
Mm-hmm.
make sure that they are aware of, you know what, I think I'm being triggered right now. I
Yeah.
think I'm leaving my window of tolerance right now. I think I'm feeling really activated,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's like in that hypoarousal state where we're just like, you know, feeling really anxious or really nervous,
Yeah.
right? So that's hypoarousal, hyperarousal. Hypo again is getting into that dissociation, just kind of like, you know, I don't know if you've seen people kind of zone out and it's like, hello, are you there?
Yep.
Right. That's more into hypoarousal, where you're on the other end of the spectrum. That looks more like depression.
Yeah, definitely. What are some tips that you have for social workers or anybody in the helping profession that maybe their window of tolerance is not quite open yet?
Mhm.
They are seeing more people come forward and talking about their traumas. What are some things or some words of advice that you have?
Yeah, so I want to go back to safety, right? Safety is the most important thing when you're dealing with trauma, because at some point or another, when the trauma occurred, there was this sense of not being safe, right? Or not being able to protect yourself,
Mm-hmm.
or loss of control, right? So we want to make sure that you are being safe, whatever that looks like. So it could be that you're minimizing your threats. So you're turning off the social media if it's too much for you,
Yeah.
or you're not watching the TV, or you're not answering calls from people who might be re-triggering you,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think, you know, safety is really important, and figuring out how you can protect yourself and keeping yourself safe from those threats. Implementing boundaries, like, I'm sorry, I can't talk to you right now because, you know, every time we talk, you go on tangents about all these terrible things that are happening to you, know what I mean?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
really trying to figure out what your boundaries are and setting
Mhm.
those to keep yourself safe.
So you touched on another thing that I think is not talked about enough, and that is boundaries. I
Mm-hmm.
think so many of us, I know growing up, I almost felt like it was shameful in a way to set too many boundaries. Like, you should be giving of yourself and make sure
Mm-hmm.
you have time for yourself. And it's
Mm-hmm.
disrespectful if you don't make time for your loved ones.
Right.
What can people do to start setting those boundaries and changing the narrative around having boundaries?
Yeah. So I think, you know, saying the word no is a way to maintain and adhere to your own boundaries, right, and protect
Mm-hmm.
yourself. And you know, I like that you mentioned, you know, growing up, that's just not what we did, because I think
Yeah.
also when I grew up, I mean, we just couldn't say no because it was
Yeah.
like you're talking back, right?
Yep. You have to
So,
do it.
right. So, you know, really trying to figure out, okay, if I do this thing for this person,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be putting myself in a place, in an uncomfortable place. So I have to say no. And so
Yeah.
for some of my clients, they're always saying yes because they don't want to be this rude person or labeled, you know, as,
Mm-hmm.
you know, not helpful or whatever. So some of the homework that I have for my clients is to say no. To say no, like,
Yeah.
you have to do this for yourself sometimes. If, you know, saying no, I'm not going to go and hang out this weekend, or no, I can't do this thing for you because I really just need to stay in and Netflix and binge watch shows. Like,
Just
this is
veg
what I
out.
need. Exactly. This is what I need to do for my mental
Yeah.
health. I think that that's okay.
Yeah. No, I think so many people need to hear that it's okay to say no.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yes.
okay. The
Yes.
first time you say no, you realize the world doesn't end. And you're like, okay, maybe I can say no one more time. And then a couple more times after that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's
Then,
really
then
awesome.
you, then you can be a no expert.
And then you can be a no expert. Yeah, exactly.
But I do want to say that, you know, you don't have to say no, like, you know, harshly. You can say, you know, that was really nice of you to consider me, you know, for this thing. I
Yeah.
really appreciate it. I'm really honored. But, you know, at this time, you know, I'm spread too thin. Like, I really, like, I don't have the
Yeah.
time to do that this weekend, or, you know, whatever. So you don't have to necessarily say no, but there are some lighter ways that you can get around. No, thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. So, okay, so we've talked about boundaries. We've talked a little bit about trauma. There's
Mm-hmm.
so much that goes into trauma.
Right.
We are in a unique climate, I guess you would say.
Mm-hmm.
2020 has been very unique, and you talked
Mm-hmm.
a little bit about isolation potentially being a trigger.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also saw that you collaborated on writing an article regarding COVID-19 being a potential trigger to previous traumas. So what recommendations do you have for viewers who might be experiencing COVID as a trigger?
Yeah. So again, you know, I think going back to this idea of helplessness,
Mhm.
when there was a trauma present that people haven't had the opportunity to work through, being in this isolation during COVID is, I think it's bringing up a lot for people,
Mhm.
and specifically, you know, this idea of grief and loss. So
Yeah.
much loss, right? We are experiencing so much loss of routine, loss of friendships, loss of, you know, being able to just go and hang out and not have to wear a mask. Like, you know,
Yeah.
those are all previous ways that don't exist for us right now. Those are
Mhm.
all losses. And when we have losses, um, I mean, that we haven't worked through, I mean, that can lead us down a depressive state. So we really have to figure out, you know, again, what we need to do for ourselves, how we need to grieve
Mhm.
some of these losses, so that we're not holding it in. We're not holding it in the body, because
Yeah.
trauma typically is held in the body. We typically hold this in our body.
Mhm.
So figuring out ways to discharge this grief, whether it's through tears, right, or abreaction what that's called, and that's through a release through tears,
Yeah.
or whether it's movement and you have to go and jog and let it out that way. But figuring out what you need to do to grieve and really validate your feelings. We don't want to
Mhm.
invalidate and say, yeah, that's, you know, that's stupid. We shouldn't be worried about this right now. You really have to validate what we're feeling. We need to validate our experiences, because that's how we move through that.
Definitely. So if I were in this position and I was considering finding a trauma-informed practitioner, what or clinician, what things should I look for in a potential therapist when starting to look for help?
Yeah. So, I think it's important to find, if you're interested in doing some trauma work, definitely finding someone who's trauma informed. So making sure that they have some type of trauma certification or trauma specialty, whether it's trauma focused CBT or EMDR, which is a way to process trauma. NARM is a new one that's out there that's helpful with processing trauma. Internal family system. So there's so many different things that people can use. So if you're looking for a practitioner who is trauma informed, definitely make sure that they have some type of trauma certification.
Okay, great. And forgive my ignorance, but can we backtrack to, you said CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, correct?
Right.
What is EDMR?
EMDR. Yeah.
What is that?
So,
I see it a lot, but I'm not quite sure what it is.
Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up, because EMDR is a really great tool for processing trauma. It has worked amazing for a lot of people in processing. So the way it works is it's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And so it's a big long word, and EMDR is much shorter and easier to say. Exactly. But it's a way to reprocess the memories. So we might so let's say that there is a memory that came up, it's a really bad memory that you have, but tied to that memory might be a negative belief that you're holding on to about yourself. Like, I'm not good enough, or I don't deserve. Right. So if you have abandonment as a child from one of your parents, you might be holding on to a negative belief of, I'm not lovable. Right. And so the memory is often tied to a negative belief that you're holding on to. And then every time we have more and more events come up in our life, we're just adding to that negative belief. And so then we're like, see, that's why, because I'm not lovable. See, I knew it. And so we just keep on reaffirming that negative belief that's tied to that one incident from way back when. So EMDR is a great way for using eye movement. So similar to when we are doing our REM sleep, right? Rapid eye movement is our brain sort of reprocessing the whole day, right? Because we get sensory input all day long, sounds, sights, our brain is constantly trying to filter that. So when we sleep, our brain is processing, getting rid of things that we don't need, saving the important things and storing it in our memory bank. So when we can do eye movement, and there's tappers, so it's bilateral stimulation. You're using both sides of the brain simultaneously. So we call it eye movement because you're moving your eyes back and forth, and you're recreating that REM state, but you're also retrieving the memory when you do that. And so we're lighting up the neural network in the brain and, retrieving the memory, and then we can process through that memory.
Wow. That is so cool.
Yeah.
That is really, really cool. Okay. And then you mentioned one more, NARMS.
Yeah, NARM. So NARM is neuroaffective relational model. And this one is more geared towards complex trauma. So EMDR is more like single event traumas, or, things that you've really held on to. You can use it with complex trauma, but NARM is more focused on complex trauma. And so remember, those are going to be the traumas, all types of trauma stacked on top and not processed. So it's a good way to kind of connect to the here and now. And staying in the here and now, but going back to that memory and then coming back to the present. So you're, the way you're thinking about it is, I can't really think of a memory. I mean, an example, but I do know that it's like you're going back to that place where this negative memory was, and then, okay, well, what would you say to yourself today.
When you were in that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So you're kind of going back and forth
Mm-hmm.
through that way, and you have someone with you to kind of process.
Yeah.
So so it's really cool. And then somatic experiencing is a new one that I actually am signed up for a training next month. But remember, we talked about trauma kind of staying in the body,
Mm-hmm.
where we hold this trauma, and because our body can't process it.
Yeah.
So somatic experiencing is another way to say, which is very similar to the yoga
Okay.
that I teach, is
Yeah.
really noticing what's happening in your body. Notice what's happening. Where do you notice some tension? Is it in your chest? You know, what does that weight feel like? Can you put a color to that sensation? Is there a texture? You know, so you're really trying to identify where your body's holding some of these things.
Yeah.
So somatic experiencing is also another one that you can use if you want to do body work first.
That is so cool. It's amazing what you learn from talking to people and in different fields, and it's just so awesome. I want to learn everything all the time.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for
Yeah,
sharing.
absolutely.
So I kind of want to talk about your trauma-informed yoga. But before we get to that, what led you to trauma work? What was your journey coming to this and then opening your own practice? Let us get to know the Diana.
Yeah. So I was born here in Texas, but I was born to two teen parents, right? And I think my mom was 15 and my dad was like 16.
Okay.
And you know, I started kind of noticing through the generational lineage that there has been trauma that happened to my dad and maybe even my mom, and those things get passed down through our DNA.
Yeah.
So I inherited some of these things, right? But you know, I think growing up to two teenage parents, it really helped me realize that they didn't have the tools that they needed back then to raise me and my siblings the way that, you know, maybe we had hoped for.
Right.
So it was just a really chaotic environment. I mean, my dad was he was addicted to substances, and you know, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the ACEs, the
ACEs study.
The ACEs study.
But
so
watching might not know. So if you
so it's the adverse childhood experiences study, and it's been really powerful because I think, you know, you rate yourself based on your adverse childhood experiences, and I have an ACEs score of 9.
Wow.
And
10, right?
Yeah, it goes to 10.
Yeah, to 10,
So, you know, growing up in that environment and having an ACEs score of a 9, you know, it was a lot for me to have to hold and process. And I didn't know. And, you know, it was just, we were in this fight or flight state all the time. My dad was very abusive. So I think, you know, when we finally moved to Austin, because we lived in a small rural town, when we moved to Austin, I just didn't know how to process any of that stuff. And so then I got pregnant at 13.
Wow. Yeah.
And then again at 15. And so I think, you know, I'm falling into these very statistic type lifestyle, I guess. Like, you know, if you get pregnant, you know, under the age of 18, if you get pregnant, you're likely going to get pregnant again. And I was like, no, that's not going to happen to me. But then I did. I was like, And so, you know, I've been living on my own since I was 16. You know, I dropped out of school and dropped out of high school, you know, teen mom, 2 kids, broke, no work. I mean, it was a lot. And so
You've come so far.
I have.
You've overcome so much. You're such an inspiration. Thank you for sharing this.
Yeah. So it was a lot. I mean, you know, I was making like $5 an hour working at a nonprofit and, you know, filing papers. And I decided, you know, and being in that environment, you know, I was kind of being pushed by some of the adults there. Like, you should go back to school. You should think about school. What are you going to do with your life? And I'm like, I don't know.
So like, why are you asking me this? I'm just trying to get by. Yeah,
exactly. So then I got my GED and started going to night school, you know, got myself into college, and I was always working during the day and school
Yeah.
at night. So it was always a lot. And that was a really long journey.
Yeah.
But I think over the years, you know, I've encountered people who have very similar backgrounds as me, very similar stories. And I started just to kind of be blown away by it. I'm just like, wow, your story's a lot like
What's going
mine. Like,
on? Yeah.
what's happening here?
Yeah.
So that really kind of led me into this work,
Okay.
into doing this trauma work. And I'm a very, like, I always like to use the problem solving model, you know, like, okay,
Yeah.
we have all these problems, but how do we fix it?
Exactly. Yeah.
Where do we
Where do we start? How do we
Exactly.
get this figured out?
Exactly. And I like challenges. So maybe that's why I'm here. But then I started to think about generational and what would have helped my parents, what would have helped my parents' parents, right? And then what's going to help my children down the road, right?
Yeah.
So so I think, you know, using that approach has really helped me figure out how I'm going to help these generations heal, because what we don't heal, what we don't repair, we repeat.
Right. We repeat. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I really appreciate you sharing your story about this and making it known that traumas can be generational. I think I've kind of taken this path to social work because I did a lot of self-reflection on myself, and the environment that I grew up in was a bit different than yours, but still my parents had things that they weren't able to process. So it carried down to us, and to no fault of their own, they just didn't know. So it's being able to educate people. And I think you're doing an amazing job of using your story and your background to help others to overcome and to make next generation and the generation after that even stronger. And I really appreciate that. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And so I don't know which one you want to talk about first, but we did talk a little bit about, and this is kind of like in our conversations on social media, but you talked a little bit about your work on trauma resiliency or trauma resilience. And you've also talked about trauma-informed yoga. I'm interested in both. So whichever way you decide to start talking is great, but I'd love to hear about both.
Yeah. So trauma-informed yoga is really great. It really ties in some of these somatic body traumas, like where we're storing that in our body, but also using a very trauma-informed approach, right? So for a lot of people, specifically people who have had sexual trauma, doing yoga may be very vulnerable, very triggering for them, right? Even doing some of the breath work. So using this trauma-informed approach, we can work through where the body's where you're holding some of these traumas without re-triggering. So it's a really great way, you know, to help, you know, maybe using some of the breath work, some of the asanas, which is where, you know, the seating style, the arranging of the body, where you're sitting. But where I like to throw those in is, again, helping people stay in their window of tolerance, helping people come back to the present time, because if we're here, if we're truly present in the moment, if we're grounded to the present time, anxiety can't live here with us. Right.
There's nothing triggering it.
Yep. Fear can't live here with us. And where those things come in are either from future oriented things that we're thinking about, that we're like, oh my gosh, next week, next year, 5 years from now, or all those things that happened in the past. So using some of the breath work really helps people kind of stay in the present time, staying in control, staying focused on, you know, their breathing, and really giving them back that empowerment that maybe they didn't have before.
Right. That's awesome. So do you teach these classes at your practice, or are they virtual? Can people sign up to take one of your classes?
Yeah, so I don't do classes yet, but I know lots of people are really interested. So that may be something that I do later on down the road. And again, we're all just trying to be innovative with COVID and trying to figure things out, right?
Figure out stuff.
But I incorporate a lot of these different techniques because I have all these different trauma styles
Okay.
that I kind of just merge in
Mm-hmm.
to help that person heal and
Yeah.
move past. So if they're getting really stuck in a certain space,
Mm-hmm.
then maybe I'll try EMDR,
Right.
or maybe we'll do some breath work, or maybe
Right.
we'll do, so it's just a good way that I like to incorporate into each individual therapy.
Yeah, and like you said, it's individual therapy. So therapy is not a one size fits all,
Right.
right?
Right.
It's individually tailored to that person, and you
Mhm.
want to make sure that when you do have a therapist, that they are not treating you like the person they had 15 minutes ago or the person that they're going to have in an hour. They're treating
Exactly.
you for you. So
Yes.
I really appreciate that you like said individuals. Some
Yes.
people think
Yes.
like, oh, you're a therapist, so I have this problem and you can fix it. But no,
Yeah.
that's not that's
Yeah.
not how it works.
Right. Correct. Yeah. It's very customized. It's very tailored to what that person needs to help
Yeah.
them move through their trauma.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay. So now I want to hear about trauma resilience.
Yes. Okay. Good. So resilience is a way. I always think about it like if you fall down and you get back up. And one of the things that an analogy that I like to use when I'm doing the work with people is it's kind of like when you get off when you fall off a bike.
Mm-hmm.
You really want to ride this bike, so you get back up, and you may fall, but you get back up, and you may fall again, and
Mm-hmm.
you continue to get back up. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that resilience, that ability to keep getting back up,
Mm.
even though it hurts.
Yeah.
You may have a scuffed up leg or a bloody leg, from scraping yourself, but you keep getting back up.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in communities of color, I think, having that resilience is going to be really important. And, there's a few things that I want to leave you with. And again, we talked about safety. So figuring out where your triggers are, figuring out how to keep yourself safe, knowing when to say no, right? Setting up these boundaries for yourself are going to be really important, because we have to minimize the threat. We have to eliminate the threat. We can't, try to do the work and then keep getting more and more threats coming in.
Exactly.
So we have to be able to turn that off. And we do that by keeping ourselves safe and really recognizing in our body what's happening. Oh, I think this is a trigger, right?
Yeah.
So the other thing is support.
Okay.
You want to make sure that you have a positive support network.
Mm-hmm.
And, I know in our culture, in the Latino culture, we might think of our support system as our family, right? But sometimes our family might be
doing
even
more harm than good.
Exactly. And there's this suck it up, get over it kind of attitude that might not be supportive. That might not be what we need. So, really thinking about who your support network is, who's on your team, who's part of your squad, right? Who's going to help you, really validate what you're feeling.
Yeah.
So that's really important. We are social beings. We cannot do this work alone.
Yes.
Even though we might like to, there's just no way.
Yeah.
We need people.
We need a hand.
Yeah. And so, we want to make sure that these are trusting connections.
Yeah.
So that's really important, really building partnerships with our support system. That's going to be really, really important. And again, with communities of color, really making sure that that you're surrounding yourself with people who are involved in this anti-racist movement, right? So we really want to make sure that that we have people on our team who are culturally aware, culturally sensitive, who aren't going to re-trigger or re-traumatize.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And then self-care. We need to make sure.
Self-care. Preach.
Yeah.
Tell us about self-care.
So self-care. So not just like going and getting a mani-pedi. I mean, if you want to, that's fine. But I mean, it's really about how you take care of you. Did I eat enough today? Did I get enough sleep? Am I drinking water? Right? So how are you taking care of you? Are you being kind to yourself? Having that self-compassion is really important because we don't want to get into this space of shaming ourselves for not doing enough. And I think that's sort of when you come from a trauma background, it's all or nothing. It's like either I'm doing good or I'm not doing good. And if we're not doing good, then we're automatically shaming ourselves for not doing good.
Yeah. Like,
right?
what do I need to be doing? How can I fix this right now?
Exactly, exactly. And that's that trauma brain. It's either this or that.
Mm-hmm.
There is no in between with trauma. So you can counter that by being kind to yourself and having that kindness and compassion. Like, oh, I'm I'm still trying to get the tools that I need to move past this. So really trying to talk to yourself in the same way that you would talk to your best friend or your loving partner, whoever your person is, right? Talk to yourself in that same way.
Right. And give
So
yourself the same appreciation that you
mhm.
give other people.
Yes, yes. So I am good enough, or I can keep myself safe. I know how to keep myself safe, right? So I think that that's really important, and that's part of that self-care approach.
I think that's so beautiful. We did a talk a while back on self-care, and I can't express it enough to people that it doesn't have to be monetary self-care.
Mm-hmm.
It can literally just be making your bed in the morning to feel like you've gotten something accomplished for yourself, or
Yep.
drinking water like you said. And so I think the more we talk about it, and especially people who come from BIPOC communities,
Mm-hmm.
I think the more people will start to understand the importance of it.
Yes, yes.
So,
And really looking at building that resilience through
mhm.
positivity and optimism.
Yes,
Yeah, having that optimistic outlook can be really helpful as well.
I definitely agree with you on that. So before we leave today, Diana, I always like to ask my guests, what is one thing that you took away from this conversation, and what is one thing that our viewers can take away and better the community with?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is, I really like that, when we were just talking about self-care and you said,
Mhm.
making your bed. And
Mhm.
that is honestly, that is how I live my life.
Yeah,
If I get one thing done today, it is going to be the bed that I
yeah.
made up. And that is
And to
it.
come home to like the sanctuary.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah,
And, it's something. And sometimes, you know, when we feel like, hey, I got out of bed today, that's progress.
yeah,
But in the same way, it's like, hey, you made up your bed today. Amazing. Good
yeah.
job. We're in a pandemic. And look what you did. You did this
So
great
many
thing,
people don't
right?
make their bed.
I know. But that's like that that is something I have to do. Like if
Mhm.
my life feels like it's not, like it's falling apart if my bed
Yeah,
isn't.
at least you made your bed.
Yeah.
You made
So
your bed and you have pillowcases on. So you did a good job.
exactly. So, again, with that self-care, just figuring out small ways that you can have, check the
Mhm.
list, check the box and say, I did this thing. It's so great. So I think that's important. And I really like that you said that. And that is something that I appreciate out of this call. And then what was the other thing? I'm sorry.
What should people watching today, what is one thing that you would like them to take away to help improve our community, to make it better?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we all have the ability to heal
Hmm.
and just reaching out to a therapist if you feel that you need it. There is nothing wrong with you if you decide you want to see a therapist. It does not mean you're broken.
Hmm.
In fact, it means that you have a lot of courage and that you care about yourself to do some inner healing, but not just for you, but also for the generations
Hmm.
that are to come, and maybe even the generations before you. So that's something that I would like to leave with people. I'm very passionate about mental health. I
Hmm.
really want to help people in that way, but also I think that it's important that we have that mental health equity, right? That
Yeah,
this is something for everyone. Everyone should have access to this. And
yeah.
currently that's not what we're seeing, right? It is very, very privileged in some
Hmm.
ways. So, just reaching out to, there's a lot of places that offer free therapy right
Right.
now. And if that's something
Hmm.
that you need, reach
Hmm.
out to people. They can reach out to me and I can link them up with some
Yeah,
people. Uh,
definitely. I'll make sure to put the link to your website and the
mhm,
description for this video. And I'll also put the link for SAMHSA is another good one.
mhm. Yes.
And for NAMI. I'll put
Yes.
those. So I'll put the links for those. And that way we can make sure that people are having access to resources.
Yeah,
And if
absolutely.
they're in the Austin area, then they can definitely reach out to you. But I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. And one more thing that I wanted to say before we
Uh-huh.
hang up is you said about like doing mental health not only for yourself but for the generations to come.
Mhm.
I think there's sometimes a stigma around self-care and mental health that if you are taking care of yourself, you're being selfish. But what you just said about taking care of yourself for people to come forward, I think that is the most selfless thing that you can do. It's not selfish at all. And I think that you said that very beautifully. And I hope that if people are watching, that's what they take away. Is selfish for taking care of yourself.
It's just like if we had a broken leg, we'd go to the doctor. You know, it's the same thing. We need all of our body parts to be working, you know, at 100%. And that's the same with our brain.
Yeah, almost, most definitely. Well, thank you so much, Diana.
You are so welcome.
And thank you to everybody who's watching today. I'll make sure to get those links for you in the bio.